is the season of water here at the Walk. This summer it is, as we're encountering the splash zone. It's a season of water, and the summer is a time when we have the late afternoon thunderstorms that come in and cut the humidity. It's a time where folks take vacations to the beach or to the lake or to the river, and they dip their toes into the nice, refreshing water. It's a time of slip and slides and watering cans and hoses that bring about new life, that calm us and refresh us. Well, for the last week and a half, I was on a vacation, and I encountered water in a totally different way. I encountered water in its raw form, and it was really actually dangerous. You would go to one place, and there would be a sign that says, "Caution, don't touch," and really it was graphic. Like, you would burn yourself, and your skin would peel off. Don't touch, it's so hot. Right down the road, you would go to water, and then you would see icebergs floating in it. Caution, don't touch, it's way too cold. Or you would be driving in the highway, and then there's a cliff on the side without a guardrail and the swirling waters of the ocean below. Or you'd show up to a beach, and it's just signs of riptide currents saying, "Don't swim." Encountered water in its most powerful and raw and overwhelming and daunting and perhaps even its most dangerous forms. Well, friends, we're going to encounter Moses and Moses' people today at a place where the water is not as much of a kiddie pool in your backyard where you're cooling off your toes, but water in the way that's really overwhelming and overpowering, perhaps even daunting and dangerous. Well, I'm Carter. I am the lead pastor here at The Walk, and I am so glad that you have joined us for worship. And so whether you are joining us here at Brightwood Church Road or you're joining us online, it is our hope and our prayer that you encounter God through this worship service in ways that are refreshing and renewing and life-giving, but also ways that are challenging, transformative, perhaps even a little bit daunting, because that's what God's good news does. Let us pray. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, friends, we gather today as people who are frustrated and angry, as people who may be hurt, as people who may be confused or skeptical, as people who might just be tired and exhausted of hearing the news, people who might have a little bit of shame or guilt of not saying something soon enough, or not speaking out when we had a chance. We gather as people whose hearts were broken this week. Our hearts broke for Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and the 5 Dallas police officers, Patrick Zamarripa, Brent Thompson, Michael Kroll, Lauren Aarons, and Michael Smith. Our hearts break for their families, for their children, for their parents, for their communities. Our hearts ache for the ways that systemic evil and oppression occupy our world and our hearts, and for the ways that we, as God's children, have often responded to violence with violence. And quite honestly, we can't really take much more of it. We've had enough. As Joey shared at 9 o'clock this morning, this is the second mass shooting in her 5 weeks of her internships that she's been here with us at the Walk. That's a lot. Too much. In 2016 alone, 512 people have been shot and killed by a police officer, and 26 police officers have been shot and killed in the line of duty. Each a child of God, each a life of sacred worth, each a life that wasn't allowed to be lived to its fullest. And it doesn't stop there. Because we've heard again and again that places that we call sanctuaries in places that we call retreats, whether they're nightclubs or schools or our worship centers or peaceful rallies. These have encountered hate and violence. They too have faced that. And so what do we do? As God's children, as people of faith, what do we do in times like these? Well, we turn to Facebook sometimes, and at other times we turn to God, and sometimes both at the same time. We pour out our feelings, we pour out our confusion and our pain. We say, enough. How much longer? What can we do? How long, O Lord, must this go on? And yet we're here. For some reason this morning, everyone here has turned off the news, has dared to leave this narrative that we keep hearing. We've dared to take a step out of our homes and take a step into faith as we gather into worship. We dare to be in relationship with people who do not have the same views or opinions or experiences as us. We dare to hope that there is a different narrative out there, that there is a different story, that this is not how it ends, but that somehow, some way, God's hope and God's love have the final say. That's why we're here. That also makes us a lot like Moses and Moses' people, where we find them today. Not just resting on the quiet shores of a beach, but we find them as people full of fear, as people full of pain, as people scared and confused and not sure what is next for them. We meet them also in the place where their courage and their hope is ignited. Because we find them today after they've already escaped. They've wandered through the wilderness. They're fleeing the Pharaoh. They're fleeing slavery because this leader named Moses has told them that there is another way, that this does not have to be the final. Yet they're full of fear and pain and confusion and anxiety as to what is next. Because they have seen the worst. They have seen the plagues. They've seen famine. They've seen violence. They've felt it. They've felt hurt as they've left behind their families. And yet they go. They moved. They left. They wandered in the wilderness, following a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And we find them today tired. We find them today at a dead end. They've wandered, and now they're resting by the sea, trapped, with nowhere to go. Feet and hearts exhausted from the journey, wondering what in the world is next. And so we turn to the book of Exodus to hear what happens next. In chapter 14, verse 5, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of the Pharaoh and his officials were changed towards the people. They said, "What have we done letting Israel leave our service?" And so his chariot made ready and took his army with them. He took 600 picked chariots and all other chariots of Egypt with officers all over them. And the Lord hardened the heart of the Pharaoh king of Egypt. He pursued the Israelites who were going out boldly. The Egyptians pursued them. All the Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his chariot drivers and his army, they overtook them camped by the sea, by Hephareth, in front of Baal-zephon. As the Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were Egyptians advancing on them in great fear. The Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you had to take us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing that we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve them than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm." Trapped between a rock and a hard place, between the encroaching armies, between the symbols of power and oppression and violence, and the great mighty sea behind them, with nowhere to turn. Overwhelmed with emotion and exhaustion, that's where we find the Israelites and Moses today. And I can imagine that they really want to have a conversation with God, similar to the conversations that we have wanted to ask this week. How long, O Lord? Enough is enough. What is next? And with a beautiful mix of snarkiness and truthfulness, the Israelites say, "Weren't there enough graves there? Why in the world did you bring us out here? What are you doing with us here?" That is not a time when I would want to be in Moses' shoes. Because he knows that God is going to deliver God's people. He has that faith, but he's not exactly sure of the plan. He does not have a map. And so then Moses turns to God to have his own conversation with God. What now? They wanted to go home. I told them to stay. What are we going to do? And so we pick up in verse 15 when the Lord responds to Moses. And God says, "Why are you talking to me? Why are you crying out to me? Tell them to go forward, not back, not stay put, but go forward. And you lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it so that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground." The next morning, and as we pick up in verse 21, it's when Moses stretches out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, and the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, and all of the Pharaoh's horses and chariots and chariot drivers. At the morning, watched the Lord in the pillar of fire, and a cloud looked down upon the army and threw them into panic. The Lord clogged their chariot wheels, so they turned with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them and against." When the Israelites and when Moses cry out to God, "How long? Enough is enough. There is no way we can go." God responds to Moses and says, "Why are you talking to me? Do something. Here's what you should do. Your way is through the sea." Your way is through the sea, through the challenging and the daunting, not the kiddie tidal pool at the beach, but through the mighty power of the sea, through the storms and through the waves. This is the God who called Moses and Aaron, and God continues to call Jesus and the disciples through the storms, through the sea, and God continues to call us through that place too. Through the unimaginable and unexpected places, through the places that have even felt daunting and dangerous. God doesn't give them the freedom to teleport or to apparate like Harry Potter and to just jump from the good to the bad to the good in a second. They cannot stay put and pretend like evil and the army around them are just going to disappear. They can't close their eyes and return home and just pray hard enough and wait long enough for them to go away. They can't give up or succumb to these armies of fear complacency, or oppression that surround them. God gives them another way. No, God says when they cry out, you cannot stay put, you cannot go back. Your way is through the sea, it is through the muck and the mess. It is through the dry, cracked land. Your way is through the dangerous and challenging waters. It's not the easiest way or even the most obvious way, but lift up your staff, God tells Moses. Stretch your hands over the waters, and your way is through the sea. I'm not one that really likes water, especially oceans. And so I don't like to imagine myself as the Israelites walking through the sea, walking through the walls of water, where we have all of our beloved and friendly and perhaps not so friendly sea creatures swimming right there looking at us. I imagine that it wasn't a straight path because God rarely gives us those. And so before you, I bet all they could see was another wall of water. Only until they got to the next turn to see that it continued. I can imagine that they walked through tired, exhausted, confused, not sure which direction this was going to go. I can imagine that as they walked, they had more conversations with God. How long, O Lord? Enough is enough. Are we there yet? It's time. Friends, when we are in these places, when we are overwhelmed with emotion, we feel like there are obstacles before us and around us that are far too great for us by ourselves. When there is fear, when there is hate, when there is violence, when there are circumstances in life that we cannot control, we, as God's people, start a conversation with God. This is something that people have been doing throughout centuries, and it's most often recorded in those of the psalmists. And one of my favorite psalmists is in Psalm 77, and the psalmist is bargaining with God. This always starts well. And the psalmist is saying, in days of trouble, I call out to God. I stretch out my hand to God at night, and my soul refuses to be comforted. And then the psalmist here begins to wonder aloud what we do so often, hoping and praying that perhaps God will overhear it and God will answer. And the psalmist starts to wonder, has God's love ceased forever? Ever felt like that? Has God in anger shut up compassion? Has God forgotten to be gracious? These are bold wonderings and bold questions. With silence from God, the psalmist chooses another tactic. Okay, God, I remember the things that you've done good. Let's start there. Your way, O God, is holy. You work wonders. You redeem your people. You have cared for me. You have cared for your people. You call people into your beloved community. You call us to turn our swords into plowshares. You call us to love one another. See, all of these things are good, and look what you have done, so please help me now. But then the psalmist gets carried away with all of the good that God has done. And the psalmist starts remembering this escape, this flight out of Egypt. And the psalmist starts talking about the waters. God, remember that time when you spoke to the waters. Your voice, your power calmed the seas and spread them apart. It was a violent storm, but you led the way. You led the way through the sea. You led us, your people, by Moses and Aaron. And then the psalm stops. Hard, dead, stop. What I think happens here is that the psalmist, and what I would like to imagine happens, as the psalmist is remembering all of the good things that God has done, and they remember this flight out of Egypt, and then they remember how God led God's people through the sea, and it required God's people to actually move, that the psalmist turned their prayers, their words of prayer, into prayers of action. And stopped and went and moved themselves. This week in the Methodist Church, this coming week, we have what is called jurisdictional conference, where we elect bishops. And so this year, at the end of the week, we're going to find out who our new bishop is in Western North Carolina. We are nominating Pastor James Howell to be a bishop in other annual conferences, and he reflected this week on the ways of the world, and he says, we all have conversations with God in these moments. But he says, I cannot know how God feels about these conversations, our thoughts and our prayers. But he is positive, he says, that God would be far more pleased if we would open our eyes, lift up our heads, get up off of our knees, and go and do something. How pointless, he wonders, is it to continue to shudder over the news and then ask God for comfort when we aren't doing anything to alter the conditions under which these killings continue to happen? How are we going to move from our hearts and our head and our words and put our prayers into action? How do they move from prayers spoken, uttered, written, to prayers embodied, to prayers that dare to step through those waters? It's not always easy. As Joey shared with us this morning, God doesn't promise anything other than God will be with us and that God says there's a promised land. God doesn't say that this path is going to be easy. And it's not exactly easy when they get to the other side, because immediately what they do is then wander in the wilderness for 3 days without any water. But what God does promise us is that God is with us. And that God doesn't liberate us, and that God doesn't free us so that we can continue to oppress or hurt others. But God leads us through these waters to freedom so that we can lead others to that place as well. So what do we do? How do we step through the sea? It starts with being willing to move ourselves and not just expecting others to move to meet us where we are. James Howell tells us too, that it's fear that is killing us from the inside. How does it look for us to respond in love and not in fear? What does it look like to open up instead of hunker down? Because what would have happened in our Christian narrative if Moses had responded in fear? Or if the Israelites had returned home in fear? It also requires that we are willing to build relationships. That we are willing to build relationships with people who have different experiences than us, who are from different races or ethnicities than us, who have different vocations than us. Because too often in these conversations that we have this week, it becomes like one side of the Red Sea against the other. We choose sides and we hunker down. Well, what we have heard and what has come to the forefront is that there are minority voices which have not been heard. So how do we listen to those experiences and affirm them so that together we can find a way to freedom to God's kingdom together. We also have people who put their lives on the line every day, who are willing to leave their families in order to encounter humanity at its worst, to provide a safe and better place for all of us. So how do we care for those people as well? How do we, as people of faith, take this first step through the water, even though we can't see the other side? It means that we have to be willing to put our prayers into action. By the ways that we live our lives, by the ways that we build community within these walls here at the Walk and beyond these walls in the world. It means choosing love first and always. And at times it really means we have to choose to listen, to hear those cries, to hear the people around us who are crying out just like we have been this week, just like the Israelites were, just like Moses was, to God. And sometimes we are the ones that are overhearing those. So how can we respond? Friends, may our prayers become actions. May they become the ways that we live, the ways that we step forward in faith through these waters.